Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard. I went from being a lawyer and partner at one of the largest firms in America to becoming an online personality and successful entrepreneur. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your health and personal life. So, how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you chase joy while achieving success? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back to Hustle and Flow. I am your host, Heather Hubbard, and today's topic is all about navigating neurodiversity. So, we are on episode 213. We are about to get started on our Get It Done challenge. So, before we get into today's interview, I wanted to remind you that if you are feeling overwhelmed with everything that has to get done before the year ends, you are already thinking about the holiday plans and your year end goals and everything at work and trying to take time off, I highly encourage you to join this free challenge where I am going to help you tackle your to do list. Now, if you have participated in a Get It Done challenge before, you know it's not just about getting it done. It's not just about the hustle, because this is hustle and flow. I am also going to help you tackle it from a perspective that is holistic and helps you maybe let go of some things, say no to some things, and learn how to prioritize what is most important. It's a 5-day challenge. It's a ton of fun, and you can even win prizes. So make sure that you are registered at getitdonechallenge.com. Get your entries in, and I will see you in 2 weeks for our 5-day challenge. But now I want to introduce to you our very special guest. So I met her through a mutual friend. And obviously, I don't have children. I don't have neurodivergent children, but I was so interested in everything that Dr. Emily was saying and knew that she would be such a special person and resource to come onto the show for those of you who do have neurodivergent children, and for all of us, because we all know someone who does, whether it's a friend, a family member, a colleague, an employee. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. So Dr. Emily King is a child psychologist and former school psychologist, specializing in raising and teaching neurodivergent children and teens. She hosts monthly parent workshops online and provides professional development to pre-K through 8th grade educators, both in person and virtually. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Emily King. Welcome to Hustle and Flow, Dr. Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we begin or really dig into the questions, I think it's important that we start with a definition. So really for anyone listening, because maybe they don't have neurodivergent children,
Mhm.
we hear about neurodiversity, but I feel like it would just help level the playing field if we actually have a definition.
Yes, so glad you asked this question. So, how I think about it is that we are all neurodiverse as a population. We all have different ways we learn, different ways we think about the world. This has always been happening, always been a thing, but we are calling it neurodiversity more these days. And then within our population, some of us are neurodivergent, which means we are diverging from what we would generally think of as the norm of that bell curve of how everyone learns in school or how everyone communicates. There are such vast communication differences, thinking differences. But generally speaking, the diagnostic classifications or labels that fall under neurodivergence are autism, ADHD, twice exceptional, so gifted and having a learning disability, or giftedness and learning disability. So any type of differences in learning would fall under that classification. Typically, anxiety alone, we don't consider a neurodivergence, but most neurodivergent people live with anxiety because the world is not built for them. The world is built in a very neurotypical way, from how education is structured to how job interviews are structured and our communities are structured in terms of how much we communicate and use eye contact, for instance, to get to know each other. And so when we're thinking about raising our kids, thinking about them going through school, becoming independent, it's really challenging parents and caregivers and educators to rethink how the world feels to neurodivergent people. And now we've got lots of great older, teens and young adults who are autistic or have ADHD and who are so good at explaining how this feels to them.
So, for those of us without neurodivergent children,
Mhm.
what would you want us to know? Like, what is it that we don't know about our colleagues, our friends, our family members who
Mhm.
do have neurodivergent children? What is it that we don't know that would be really helpful if we did know?
Yeah. So thank you again for asking that question too. What would be so helpful to know is that school is very hard for many of these children. We think about school just being hard for kids with dyslexia or for kids who have a math disability or writing disability, just like an academic disability. And that's true too. But when you have an executive functioning weakness, which comes along with ADHD and autism most of the time, most of school is executive functioning. It is staying organized, planning, being able to do two things at once, which none of us can really do two things at once, but really that's more about cognitive shifting, being able to listen and then take notes, or listen and then remember like 2 to 3 step directions, all of those things, which actually have nothing to do with intelligence. They have to do with executive functioning and organization. So I would want everybody to know that school is very hard, which means that kids are very exhausted after school. The same social opportunities or extracurricular opportunities are also not a great fit always. So when you are maybe around friends of yours, colleagues who have kids with neurodivergent children, thinking about the problems you have are probably not the same problems that they have. You might have I'm just going to use an example. You might have a problem about, your child not being in the same placed in the same class as their best friend. Whereas your friend or your colleague who has a neurodivergent child, that really might hit them in a way that they are just wishing that their child did have a friend to
Mm.
miss, things like that. The experience is just really different. The goals are different. Success is measured in a different way when raising neurodivergent kids. As a mom raising neurodivergent boys, and I've worked with these children in my practice for over 15 years after working in schools, success is truly connected just to their happiness and satisfaction and their effectiveness in the world. Like, do they feel effective at what they're
Mhm.
doing? And isn't that what we want for all of our kids? So, the way that our kids feel effective and satisfied and confident is just different than how culture defines that. And so, that's what I would want everyone to know.
So I don't have children. I think the listeners know this. So anytime I do an interview that involves children, I pick up the phone and start calling my friends with children because I can ask questions from a place of curiosity,
Mhm.
but I don't always know the best questions that would be helpful. So I spoke with a few different friends who actually have neurodivergent children. And I said, what would you want to know from Dr. Emily? And they all said it in different ways, but time and time again, it was really, I felt like the biggest through line was how do you balance wanting to help your child be successful and happy as a child, but also knowing that it's not just school. One day they're going to have to enter what a lot of them kept referring to as the real world, um, entering into the workplace. And so, how do you balance letting them be who they are and knowing that you're trying to set them up to be successful as adults when, as a parent, you may not always be around?
Right. So then that leans into the conversation of striving for independence, which is sometimes separate from striving from a college degree or a high school diploma. And of course, we want our kids to be able to go as far as they can in school because our culture recognizes a high school diploma or a college degree or an associate's or a bachelor's, whatever comes of it, as a benchmark to you were able to do this level of education. But that is absolutely just one part of how we define success. The other parts are more about self care, taking care of our bodies and our spaces and our belongings, learning how to manage money and cook food and, bank and all these things that and travel, are we a kid that's going to learn to drive or not? Do we need to learn how to navigate the city we're planning to live in independently without our parent driving us around? These are things that even parents of intelligent kids, so where we get all mixed up is intelligence versus like functional living ways. And there's so many intelligent kids who struggle to, who may not be someone who drives, who struggles to do things that we would make assumptions about in the general population of this child. I've worked with college educated autistic adults who either have visual spatial weaknesses and aren't able to drive, or have such high anxiety that they're not able to drive. And yet they're able to have completely wonderful jobs that satisfy them. So it's finding the way that your child will be successful, which may not be what your vision in your head is initially. It usually isn't, and this is true for all parents. I don't know why we believe we're like, I'm going to have a baby and I already have this dreams for this baby and we don't even know this baby yet. Right. And, when you have a neurotypical child, that might be the difference between, I can't believe they're into theater. I was thinking they'd be into football. That's how, that's the flex we have to do as parents. And, I have one kid that's kind of the difference. I'm like curious of what he's going to be into. And then I have another kid where we're just figuring out wherever he is successful and happy, we're doing it, and figuring out what he is into. So it's constantly following those breadcrumbs of what's next and what's next and what's next in terms of my child's interests and in terms of your child's skills. So it's always trying to push them forward with their motivation, interest, and skills. And yes, there is a balance of helping keep them mentally well so that they are not so stressed and flooded with demands that they can't make progress, but also cultivating a community around them that is also supportive, whether that's siblings, neighbors, people in your church or people in your neighborhood, extended family, who your child can use as supports when parents age or parents get older. And so there's a lot of fear there with parents understanding they can't be their child's only person to do these things. So it's a balance of expanding that village and also empowering your child to be as independent as possible. And they don't, none of us are 100% independent. We rely on doctors, we rely on experts, we rely on all these people in our communities to know things that we don't know, or to, I should not be fixing any type of plumbing in my home ever. Like we rely on all these experts to do things. So none of us are independent. So we just need to think about, what does that independence look like for my child, and what kind of supports can I set up for them, or can I help them learn to troubleshoot themselves?
So another question that came up would be, I think similar, but it's really, okay, as they are children. So trying to celebrate who they are, allow them to be, which may not look typical to a lot of families. But then sometimes you move into an environment in our society, in our community, where now they're expected to show up and behave in a certain way, and really navigating that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you try to make them show up and conform? Do you just tell others, oh, they're neurodivergent, they're not going to, right? Just really navigating that piece of, okay, well, we're not in the home, we're somewhere
Mm-hmm.
else. How do we actually navigate this?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on what your goals are in that setting. For a child who is going into a school setting, then we're thinking about what skills do they need to be a student. And that's a whole different big can of worms we can open up if we want to talk about education and teachers, shifting their framework around neurodivergent kids. But let's say it's just, being with extended family, or being at a holiday celebration, or being in Target, or whatever the situation is. Usually when we ask kids to push themselves to conform or be something that is harder than the skill level they have, there is this window of tolerance and window of growth, right? Of like, I think my child can extend a little bit beyond, but if we go too far and we are asking them to do something that's really outside of their capacity, we're either going to force that child to do what we call masking in autistic research. And what that means is that they learn to be something different on the outside than they are on the inside. And those are usually our internalizers. Or we are going to push them into having problematic externalizing behavior, which is tantrums and aggression and arguing back and saying awful things. And both are emotionally dysregulating and not something we want to do, but it's fine. You have to know your kid and find that balance. And we're going to get it wrong where we try pushing them in some instances. But I want to give parents permission, if any parents are listening who are raising neurodivergent kids, or if you're the family who is seeing a dysregulated child in Target or at a family gathering, that child is just at capacity or over capacity. And especially when we're talking about autism, when a child is overwhelmed and they also may not have the social nuances to be motivated to please anyone or to really be motivated about, how they're looking in that situation. This can feel embarrassing to a parent, but it may not feel embarrassing to your child. One thing is, I've learned as a parent and worked with many families about over the years is like, you got to know which places are your scene. Like there's some places that I knew when my children were young, I'm like, this is not our scene. My kid cannot attend this long, cannot sit in a chair this long. This is like a meltdown waiting to happen. And this situation is not worth it at this point in my child's development. Now, there could be another time or maybe several years later where I felt like with a certain amount of support, this child could do this with practice and it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it to try to be able to eat at this table at Thanksgiving or to be able to, one example that comes to my mind just with the holidays coming up is opening gifts in front of people can be really overwhelming to anxious kids. And especially if you have an autistic child who absolutely tells the truth about everything they feel. They may open a gift and say, I already have one of these. Why did somebody give me this? And they're just like honestly stating the truth. But of course, that can come across as very rude to a relative who doesn't know what's going on. So you can make a call. Like, are we going to open gifts in front of everyone? Or are we going to explain, hey, my kid does really well to open gifts privately and then is going to reach out to you to we'll let you know, how excited they were about it. And so you can control some of those things as you're thinking about different situations, but it always depends on your child's skill level, how comfortable you are in that situation, supporting them and knowing that I think they're ready to work on this, but they're going to need some of my support in this situation. And then we've got to let people know, right? If we don't let people know what's going on with our child, they will make assumptions. They'll just make assumptions. And usually those assumptions, they're confused. When people are confused about even a child's behavior, if they've had the experience, they'll think like, I don't know what's going on, but I think that child is having a hard time. We want to help people know that kids are having a hard time, not giving people a hard time. And so that distinction is really important to help those without neurodivergent kids or that just don't have the experience of having a neurodivergent family member or friend to figure out how to support that.
Speaking of that, what's one of the biggest mistakes that those of us who don't have neurodivergent children, what is one of the biggest mistakes that we actually make that's not helpful, that's not supportive, but we may not even realize we're doing it?
Mm-hmm. I would say, from my perspective, it's just having that reaction of sympathy and saying, I'm so sorry, because we're not sorry about our kids. We're not, we don't feel like we need to apologize. Like we don't feel like, our life is terrible. Like, is it hard sometimes? Absolutely. Is parenting any kid hard sometimes? Absolutely. But, we can just skip over that because what that is usually is a person feeling confused and not knowing what to say, but feeling bad or feeling pity for us because it looks hard, which is true. It's kind of similar to how I kind of compare it is, let's say you have a toddler, like a 2 or 3-year-old who is tantruming in Target, like totally expected. All 2 and 3-year-olds like throw it down every now and then and make a fuss, right? No one's going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry you have a toddler, right? Like we just like see it and we're like, oh, I get it. I get that. Or, even if you don't have kids, you're like, oh, yeah, that's how 2-year-olds act. Like most of us know that. But a bigger kid that might be doing that because developmentally they're behind the curve on their social emotional regulation, it's surprising and confusing and we don't really know what to do. So I would just suggest doing what you would do with any other kid and asking if that parent needs any help. Hey, you good? Or you need any help? Can I do anything to help right now? And just like you would, if you saw a parent, you know, sitting on the floor with their toddler in the toy aisle, waiting it out. Can I bring you a coffee? you know.
I love that. I'm literally, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking through some examples. I'm like, I think I've done that. And so that's so helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. When we talk about parents, especially if you own your own business, you're an
Mhm.
entrepreneur.
Mhm.
And speaking to at least one friend, she's in this position. She was like, I feel exhausted a lot.
Mhm.
And but as you mentioned, a lot of parents might feel that way. So, what are some tips that you have on, yeah, to balance? Like, I'm got my own business, I'm trying to be an entrepreneur, and I'm trying to support my neurodivergent child. And sometimes it feels like I'm getting pulled back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the stats on this, but I would guess that lots of families where you're raising neurodivergent kids, one of the parents has at some point, if they've been able to, pivoted into owning their own business. And I think the reasoning behind that is it is really hard to have a full-time job with structured hours when you have a child that does developmental therapies at, let's say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or goes to there are multiple therapy appointments that need to happen. That's the other thing I would add on to your one of your first questions of what other people can know is that when neurodivergent kids are young, extracurriculars aren't happening yet because they're all usually in some developmental therapies. And then when we get to the extracurricular activities, everybody's like, at least in my area, like a pro baseball player at like age 10. So those are some other differences to think about. But when I'm thinking about just the schedules and the boundaries of having my own business, one of the reasons that I have loved not only being in private practice, because I have worked prior to private practice, worked for school districts where I have certain hours, I have to be certain places. Scheduling is out of my control. I just have to show up. That is very hard without an incredibly understanding manager or boss. So if you're a manager or boss listening, know that these parents are going to have school meetings in the middle of the day. They're going to have more doctor's appointments, more therapy appointments. And often what happens is because of that pressure, one parent will figure out some sort of, either work from home flexibility or entrepreneurship. I will say what comes with that, though, is you have to now set all your boundaries. You don't have a boss saying, there's enough on your plate. I'm not giving this to you. Right. So, what I have found in my work is I've had to do a lot of personal work with my therapist, with my, family and my husband, and conversations and figuring out where I have felt like I'm at capacity and figuring out, do we even need to commit to this thing? Is this something we want to do? Does this lead me to where I want to go in my goals? Basically, is this worth it from a business perspective? Because it is taking me away from family duties. Now, this all will ebb and flow over time when your children are in school or when you have childcare. It is much harder when they're young, and every family knows that it's super hard to work when you have little kids. With neurodivergent kids, they may need more support longer. It's harder to find childcare when you have kids that are highly anxious or might need behavioral support. It's harder to find really seasoned people who connect with your kids and can help support them. So those are all things that can lead to that mental load that's exhausting for a parent of a neurodivergent kid. You're always thinking about meetings and doctor's appointments and your schedule and their schedule, and then on top of that, all of the fears about the future. So I always say, when you're making decisions about boundaries for your work, is it leading to a goal that you have set? And if not, then take it off your plate. And then when I think about when those worries crop up about my kids, like I'm always like one school year at a time, just one school year at a time. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole of thinking about like, oh my gosh, are they going to be doing this behavior in 5 years? Just one school year at a time, because I know this from my work, but also watching my own kids. We just cannot predict what these kids are capable of. Like their development, and in a good way, their development is so asynchronous that progress is not a straight line at all. I mean, it isn't for anyone, but it's especially true for neurodivergent kids. And they can have some really overwhelming, scary behaviors when they're little that make you flash forward to, oh my goodness, imagining that in a 15 or 16-year-old kid's body. And just don't do that yet. Just one school year at a time.
I'd love to loop back to the concept of the managers and
Yeah, let's talk
right
about it.
because we've got I know we have a lot of just professionals that listen that
Mhm,
are in management positions.
mhm.
And so I'm curious if there are certain things that you see that companies really don't do well to support. I mean, it could either be parents with neurodivergent children or it could be employees who are neurodivergent. And because I'm sure you have some thoughts on how companies can actually improve
Mhm.
and the ways that they can actually support people.
Yeah, I hope in 10 years this is becoming just such a mainstream part of our, maybe hopefully before 10 years, but I feel like that's always my like 5 to 10 years feels like it takes that long for change in education and in business. But so those are two very different things that I feel like are going to come together at some point, just because the kids that we are educating around advocating for themselves now, and the changes we're trying to make in education now of helping kids self-advocate, in 5 to 10 years, those kids are going to be going into the workforce. But the workforce has got I mean, the interviewers have got to change how they approach those kids coming into the workforce. There are some really great programs. Usually they're local. So wherever you are listening, in North Carolina, where we are, we have a great program called Link It, which is for college educated autistic individuals and matching them with companies. And they go in and train the managers on how to communicate best with these autistic young adults, and they train the autistic young adults. So for instance, in the past, a lot of the interventions have been on the autistic person, for instance, and not so much on anyone else in their world, which it's always been my passion that like that's easier to change. It's easier to coach the managers or coach the families or coach the teachers. So, just as an example, when we're talking about like hiring practices, so a traditional interview approach taps into every single weakness of an autistic person. You have to dress in fancier clothes for really no reason at all. You have to, you have to show up and talk to people you've never met before, which can be highly anxiety provoking. I mean, it is for all of us, right? And then they're going to directly ask you questions. And when it feels overwhelming to look at people or to shake hands and touch people that we don't know, like think about all those things. However, many autistic individuals are highly skilled at lots of visual spatial things, memory things, all types of tech jobs, engineering jobs, those types of things. And so thinking about how you can understand that person's skills first before you go to the social aspect of getting to know them, which is opposite of what we usually do. We like get to
Yeah.
know each other first and then we look for work samples or jobs. So thinking about the interview actually being someone coming in and whatever they want to wear, coming in to be as comfortable as they can to explain some sort of project that they've developed or some sort of thing that they've done in the past or some interest that would align, even down to how we write job descriptions. I will say that so many autistic, and I'm talking about autistic adults right now, but some of these would be relevant to ADHD populations where, people just need really job descriptions and what we actually do in jobs just really need to match our energy levels. That's more for ADHD folks. But for autism, the way we write job descriptions, they may take every single bullet point really literally. So I've worked with young adults who will see that like you're supposed to be able, like job descriptions will say like you're supposed to be able to lift this much weight in your job or something, and it's maybe a like that really could be thrown out. You can still do this job without being able to do that, for instance, but they won't even apply because they see this bullet point on here. So that gray area thinking of they haven't even applied to it because they've ruled out that they're a fit for it. So those are just some things to think about. Of the literal thinking, the demonstrated skills is so much more effective in figuring out if that person is going to be an asset to your team. And it's one thing that Linkit says in their program in North Carolina, which is funded by the state, which is a great program that collaborates with lots of businesses, is that we're missing out on a lot of talent because these people have a lot of great talents that neurotypical brains actually can't do, which is fascinating sometimes to me. And I see this in really, like gifted autistic populations of people. The thing I would say about parents who are employees in companies and managers is that, I've worked with parents who are going through seasons of life with their kids that are so hard that they need to take family leave. Like, for instance, there sometimes are kids that, you're trying to figure out medication for your child. Their sleep is really off. They're not able to go to school because of some medical thing. If you have a huge interruption in childcare, but your child is 10 years old, that can be harder to understand, but know that if your child has a disability, that could absolutely be happening. So being flexible with family leave, being honestly just what's happened with how flexible everyone has become with work from home and hybrid models has been really helpful. So for instance, in my own family, my husband and I both work full time, but one of us is always work from home. And we started that during COVID because of the whole, like, if somebody's got the sniffles, they can't go to school today, no matter what's wrong with them, right? But we've kept it in place because even though my boys are a little older now, it is just logistically so helpful for one of us just to be there, just in case something happens. We don't have to think about who's going to stay home with them if someone's sick. Even though we are working from home, then we don't have to call in sick or change our schedule unless somebody's obviously really sick and needs us to be there. But those type of flexibilities in terms of needing to leave in the middle of the day for meetings or getting called by the school because something has happened at school, that's going to be possibly more frequent than a child who doesn't have a disability.
Okay, so this has all been so helpful, so informative for parents of neurodivergent children. Will you share briefly about the monthly workshops that you do and your Substack, just so for people who want to know more and can get more support from you, how they can do that?
Absolutely. So you can go to learnwithdremily.substack.com. I host monthly live workshops, but they're always recorded and they're all archived there on Substack. It goes back a little over a year. So there are 12 or 13 workshops there that you can dig into. They're usually about 35, 40 minutes. So you can listen to them or you can watch. If you do come live, there's time for Q&A. So that's the bonus you get if you come live. They're usually at 10 o'clock on Friday mornings on Eastern time. And then also you can just read my blogs there. Those are free for everyone. And then if you're listening and you feel like it would be helpful for teachers in your life to know more about my work, I also do professional development for educators.
Thank you so much. I know we've been trying to work this podcast out for a really long time, but I'm so glad that we made it happen because it's been very helpful for me. And I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of the listeners or for those who are watching on YouTube. So Dr. Emily, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, give the episode a like and leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future episode or announcement. Listening on Apple, Spotify, or another podcast app, you can watch the video and join in the after show conversation by visiting hustleandflowpodcast.com.